Imagine being summoned to the river at night for a confession, not by mercy, but by a voice that should have been refuge. The moon hangs thin over São Joaquim, and the water answers in a slow, metallic whisper. They called him holy in the light of day. That same man walked the path to the chapel with a cassock that smelled of incense and sweat. At night he walked a darker road. This is the story the countryside learned to tell about 1784, revealing the dark secret of the priest, a story of revenge. If you want more forgotten histories revealed, subscribe and stay with me through this one. Fazenda São Joaquim sat along the river like a careful lie. From the manor house, you could see the narrow silver of the São Joaquim River threading the cane fields, the whitewashed chapel, the small cluster of slave quarters whose roofs smoked in the mornings. The captain, Capitão José Ribeiro de Souza, ruled with a mix of legal force and neighborly charm. His wife, Dona Mariana, kept a careful grace and a sharper tongue. Between sermon and market, law and custom, the plantation shaped what was seen and what was buried. The river itself was a presence everyone lived with and around. It brought fish and trade, it carried away refuse and rumor, and it kept the plantation honest in a way the captain could not. People baptized children at its shallow banks, washed linen on its stones, whispered secrets into the current. For the enslaved, the São Joaquim was both life and danger. A steady route toward the quilombos upriver, a place where bodies might disappear as if swallowed by a patient god. In the center of this small, violent universe stood Frei Manuel da Conceição, a friar assigned to the region. To the world he wore a cassock like armor. He led mass, blessed the fields, wrote letters of condolence and official watchfulness. In the market, his hand on a Bible made him a man whose words traveled beyond his person. The chapel door closed behind him in the mornings, and he returned with the day's smallpox of incense and piety. The parish registers bore his neat handwriting. People trusted him, and Francisca, quiet, careful Francisca, moved through the plantation like a shadow with a name. Once married to a man who ran for freedom and never returned, she had been left with the silence that followed such departures, the fear that a wrong look would be read as the start of trouble, the economy of words learned inside a senzala where restraint was survival, the invisible ledger of favors and debts an enslaved woman held in her body and memory. She cleaned the chapel for coin and kept the linen of sacred things folded with reverence that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with keeping a place for herself in a world that measured her by labor and yield. It began in small, almost ludicrous ways, a hand lingering too long on a shoulder during confession, an insistence that she needed a private word after the service. He called it spiritual counsel, others called it a mercy visit. The priest's voice had a warmth that suggested protection. On nights when the captain and his wife entertained at the manor, Frei Manuel would ask Francisca to come and sweep the chapel after the candles had been snuffed. Then he would stand closer than the chapel required, mention sins in a tone that tightened the throat, and offer comfort that was not comfort at all. What people later called a pattern grew around him like a low, persistent tide. The saintly man who blessed marriages and salted the garden with holy water used the word confession as a key to rooms and bodies. He invited certain women to meet him by the river under the pretense of privacy and penance. These were not generalized assaults recounted in breathless detail. They were coercion shaped by power. For those who listened now, the language is careful. He took advantage, he abused his authority, the women were forced. We do not speak of the precise mechanics, we speak of the injury left behind. Pregnancies followed in the wake of those appointments. When a woman's belly showed, the options on a plantation were cruel and narrow. A child born to an enslaved woman did not slip into the world with basic protections. It meant extra suspicion, extra risk. According to the accounts passed among the senzalas, when a woman's condition was noticed, she was summoned to the house, given a small bowl of bitter tea, and told it was medicine to keep the womb healthy. The tea ended certain conversations, and some pregnancies. People say this of many places, and in São Joaquim they said the same. The tea was handed, the stomach shrank, and the rumor of who had fathered the child circled the yard like a carrion bird. Dona Mariana, when she learned of such things, folded her disappointment into a practiced rage. The mistress of the house could not always touch the men she wished to punish. She had a social theatre to perform, condemnation of sin, preservation of lineage, but she also had reasons to maintain the status quo. The captain, for his part, watched these shadows with the same indifference he watched Cain grow. His interest was in output, in reputation, in the smooth operation of a property whose value must not be questioned. The friar's office gave him cover, the priest's sanctity was a buffer. Silence became a shared commodity. What the enslaved women learned to keep for themselves, they also learned to pass on in whispers. The senzala was a place of survival. Inside, women braided these stories into songs and warnings. Some spoke aloud at night. Others mouthed the story as a litany to a younger generation, a way to prepare a child for a world that stole more than land. Maria, her friend and neighbor, kept a different cadence. She would retell the nights as if testing them on the air, asking, "Do you remember when the river took his footprints?" And nobody could say for certain which parts were fact and which parts were the comfort of a shared tale. A short note on the world beyond these people's private torments. Slavery in late 18th century Goiás was a landscape of forced labor, uneven law, and small pockets of human negotiation. Plantations were built where the land and river allowed crops to be moved to market. The Catholic Church was woven into that economy. Chaplains offered spiritual justification at times and acted as instruments of order at others. The presence of a friar on a plantation lent both sacral and secular authority. He performed baptisms that marked a human life with a church name. He absolved sins. He wrote to lawyers and landlords in the same hand. In this context, a priest's moral weight could protect him from immediate suspicion. That protection shaped what could be said aloud and what had to be buried. "She never said it like the books do," one older washerwoman told anyone who would listen. She would throw her head back and say his cassock smelled like a wet dog, and then she would start to cry. Those were the signs we looked for, the smell, the way her hands trembled. That's how we knew. This voice is not a formal testimony. It is an oral line drawn through generations. It reveals how people read each other's bodies in the absence of legal recourse. The pattern hardened into a tempo. The friar asked for confessions, the women complied out of fear, and the ritual's structure. The pregnancies came, a bowl of tea was offered when discovery risked the captain's peace. Francisca carried each episode like a ledger she could not show. After a while, the ledger's weight pressed on her. Silence was endurance, but endurance has limits. At first, Francisca's response was small and tactical. She learned the friar's habits. She noticed when he walked with a slight favor to one foot after a hard mass. She noted the way his cassock dragged through the dew if he lingered too close to the river's reeds. She watched the times he took a carriage to town and when he preferred to travel by horseback. These details were not trivial to her. They were the raw material of a plan. There is a logic to the slow burning of someone who has been wronged and cannot go to law. Revenge is a word that looks clean on a page, but smells of ash in the mouth. For Francisca, it started with patience. She watched the current at low tide, the places where the river's teeth took hold. She learned which roots reached like prison bars beneath the water and which banks held firm against the weight of a body. In the cool mornings she waited at the chapel door and listened as Fray Manuel sorted his keys, counting his footsteps until she could map where he would be most vulnerable. Her preparation was not melodramatic. It involved small acts of practical cunning. She folded wet linen with the priest's cassock on top, aware of the wet weight of the fabric. She became attentive to the smell of oil he favored, and used it to cover her own scent when she moved near the river. When she had a chance, she watched him cross the narrow footbridge with a monk's gait and made a mental map of the grasses that would help muffle sound. She waited until the right moon, the right season where the river was high enough to hide tracks, but not so strong as to be treacherous to the one who conceived the plan. There are witnesses who will tell you that Francisca practiced with stones, tossing them into the current to study how quickly they sank and where the eddies swallowed sound. Others insist she never confessed to any such rehearsal. They say she simply learned from watching fishermen pull nets. We will never know which details are true. What the memory agrees on is her transformation, from a woman who survived to one who acted. On the appointed night in 1784, a detail insisted upon by those who passed the story down, Fray Manuel told Francisca to meet him by the river for confession. The moon was a thin coin that night, and the cane fields rustled like distant, ill-fitting clothes. Francisca accepted. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed the lightest part of their plan, a shawl to hide the dampness of the cassock if needed, a small weight in her apron, and an unreadable face. The river scene is the heart of the tale, and the place where the storytellers guard their language. The accounts do not conspire to offer a precise blow-by-blow of violence. Rather, they layer sensation upon sensation, so that the audience understands what happened without being given the anatomy of harm. What is said speaks in touch and sound. The priest came forward with his usual language of sin and penance. Francisca listened. She felt the cassock under her fingers, heavy with damp and with the illusion of sanctity. He reached for her with the kind of familiarity his power had taught him to practice, and she moved with the force of someone who had rehearsed restraint until it became a weapon. She pushed, she held. There is a single line repeated in many versions. She placed him in the river. Another version softens it. She forced him into the current and let the water do what it had been ready to do. The verbs are careful. The water closed over the cassock. The river took the sound of his clothes beating the surface and folded it into itself. Witnesses later spoke of muffled splashes and a final surprising silence. The sort of silence that arrives after a long, audible struggle. They spoke of Francisca standing at the bank, her hands wet, her breath a hard thing in her chest. Some say she whispered not a prayer but a single private name. Others say she simply turned and walked back through the cane. We must resist the urge to name this action with any single moral gloss. For some it was murder, for others the execution of a hidden justice. The law of the land could have called it an ordinary crime to be punished. The moral economy of the plantation called it something else, a rebalancing that would go unwitnessed and unrecorded. Those who tell the tale insist on the ambiguity. Francisca did not act in a courtroom. She acted in a world where courts would never have heard the complaint. That elemental unfairness hangs over the event like the river's mist. Immediately after, the plantation went quiet in different ways. Fray Manuel did not appear at Mass. His handwriting did not mark the registers for Sunday. The captain sent a man upriver to fetch news, and a week later returned with a dispatch that the friar had left for the town on some ecclesiastical business. People believed the story at different levels. Some accepted the official line. He had been called away. Others read the absence as a smudge on a paper body. Something had happened, but could not be acknowledged. Francisca did not remain long on the plantation after the night by the river. According to local accounts, she left in a matter of months toward the Quilombos upriver, where fugitives and runaway communities offered a precarious refuge. Whether she found peace is a question the story refuses to answer simply. She became, in the oral life of the region, both the woman who walked away and the woman who had done what was necessary. In different tellings, she is either exiled or free. A few years later, the river gave a remark of evidence back to the world. Fishermen pulled up a length of cassock rooted in weeds and bones caught in the reeds, a discovery that sent the plantation into the kind of clatter that finally forced questions. Those who found the fabric remembered the coarse stitching and the seam where a priest's initials were embroidered. It was enough to let rumor become a narrative in a way it had not been before. People began to say with more certainty that the friar had been claimed by the river. But even then the tale refused to settle. Versions multiplied. Some accounts insisted the bones were older, belonging to an animal. Others described a discovery so stark that the captain was forced to hire a man to remove the evidence in the night and sink it out of sight. The point of these contradictions is not to confuse. It is to show how truth travels when only certain people are allowed to tell it. For those whose lives depended on saying nothing, the river was both a participant and a witness, whose testimony could not be subpoenaed. What they whispered in the senzala, an older voice would say, was not that she had killed a man for sport. It was that she had killed a man who had killed her dignity over and over. Another voice, rasping and patient, added, "We don't say we cheered. We say we breathed when it was over. We did not believe law would come for us. That is why she did it." To deepen understanding of the social weave that made such a night possible, consider how a priest's role on a plantation could be both spiritual and administrative. He performed rites that humanized the enslaved in ritual, but often left them legally and economically unprotected. A blessing at birth did not alter a child's status. A sacrament did not create a defense in the face of an owner's power. Because clergy were also mediators with the outside world, letters, loans, occasional favors, they gained a protective halo that could be used to deflect suspicion. In São Joaquim, this halo turned malign when the priest used it to gain access to bodies that he had no right to command. There are many ways a community keeps its internal balance. On the plantation, silence served a purpose. It kept the master's house running and protected those within its walls from the cost of interrogation. But silence also made possible private violences. The existence of a single person who could claim moral authority and wield physical power without accountability is a small but lethal engine. The story of Francisca and Fray Manuel explains one such engine in human terms: how trust can become a weapon when placed in the hands of someone not answerable to the vulnerable. Our witness vignette that circulates is small and private. Maria would say, "I remember her hands after. They smelled of river and cassock, and they trembled, but not from fear. It was as if the shaking belonged to someone whose bones had been recounted." Another woman, an elder who had been a washerwoman since long before Francisca arrived, told the tale in sharper lines. "We put our ears to the ground and heard the plantation breathe different." That is how we knew something had changed. It took the air out of the house. As the story moved from immediate memory into folklore, it gathered moral weight that did not simplify the truth. In some taverns, quietly and with the understanding of the room, people called Francisca a thief and a killer. In the cabins along the river, she was sometimes a saint of last resort. The river itself became a character, its personality shaped by the telling. Some said it was a God-sent judge. Others said it was merely a place where human cruelty finally found an equal force. Neither metaphor captures the full complexity. What remains is a human life enacted within systems that made law impotent for certain people. There is an image people love to bring forward: Francisca at dawn, her back to the sun, washing linen by the water where the priest had once stood. She rinses the fabric until it glides shiny as a memory. Some say she left a smear on the cloth, her guilt or her courage, read as you will, and kept walking. Others say she took a canoe upriver and vanished into a community that was less a place than an ethic of refusal. The versions expand until they fit the needs of the teller: a warning to daughters, a comfort to those left behind, a cautionary tale for men who believed themselves untouchable. The moral calculus here resists tidy resolution. To call the killing a simple act of vengeance is to ignore the legal and moral vacuum that birthed it. To declare it righteous is to ignore the life taken and the fact that, in taking that life, Francisca stepped outside the law she had no access to. The story lurches between pity and fury, between the need for justice and the human appetite for retribution. That tension is perhaps the most honest place a listener can stand. Years later, the story persisted in the area around São Joaquim. Children were told to stay away from the reeds at night. Women used the tale to teach where to fold their hands in prayer and where to watch the men in cassocks. In the market, people bought cloth and told the story with the cadence of a prayer and the sting of a warning. Some versions placed the event in 1784 and marked subsequent turns with years. Francisca leaves in 1786. Bones are found in 1789. The captain grows old and dies in 1802. Other storytellers preferred a few years later and let the river manage exactness. The point was not chronology, it was memory. A final witness fragment comes from a man who fished at the mouth of the São Joaquim for 50 years. He said in a quiet voice, "I never saw the priest after that year. I did see Francisca once, wrapped in a blanket, standing on a hill as if she were listening to the world. She didn't look free, but she didn't look like she'd been broken. That is the part that I think about. What is freedom after you have had to steal it?" Folklore took the story and worked it. In some tellings, the river speaks back. It is said that the water carries a voice at night. Some hear a prayer, others a complaint. Children dared one another to step to the bank and listen, and sometimes the older ones would add an extra line to scare or console. These details change the tone from legal reckoning to shared human feeling. They keep the past alive because they allow people to translate terror into something that can be shaped into a warning or a small ritual. It is important to return now to a sober point. Many of the specifics in these stories are contested. Records from the time are thin, and where a document exists it may carry the biases of the men who preserved it. The names, Fray Manuel, Capitán José, Dona Mariana, Francisca, linger in oral history and in a few scratched ledger entries, but to call the story an archive without qualification would be a falsehood. We must say, then, that this is the story that circulated in the region, and that the tale of 1784 became a means for people to name a wrong that the law would not name. That said, the story has a life beyond record. It talks about the moral machinery of a plantation, about the ways religious authority can shelter violence, about the choices available to those who are enslaved. It also pushes us to think about what counts as justice. Is a private killing, carried out in an environment where public justice was denied, a crime that deserves condemnation, or a desperate measure that asks for understanding? History does not hand us an answer. It hands us testimony, rumor, scraps of cloth, and the smell of river algae. When you leave São Joaquim in your mind, consider what remains after such stories settle. The river continues to run, indifferent to human verdicts. The cassock, if ever found and stitched back on a line, tells a story in its wear. The captain's ledger closes, but people in the senzala pass the narrative along. The truth of the night lives both in the facts of disappearance and in the moral improvisation people use to survive. So what are we left with? Not a neat judgment, not a single truth. We are left with the quiet bravery of a woman who chose a path carved by desperation, with a community that held its breath and whispered, and with a river that became both witness and instrument. We are left with ambiguity, which is perhaps the more honest relic of violence committed inside a culture of silence. If you are sitting with this story and trying to pick a side, I will ask you simply to offer one word in the comments below: justice or law. Which do you think mattered in 1784 at São Joaquim? Type one word and share this video with someone you think should hear this hidden history. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that surface the past's quiet wounds. In the end, the story of Francisca and the priest is an invitation to listen to what rivers remember. They remember more than water and fish. They remember how people use them to move goods and to hide misdeeds, how they can give back a fragment of truth when the world below refuses to speak. The legend that grew around 1784 is not merely a tale of revenge. It is an archive of the ways power and faith were used and misused, and of the desperate arts people invented to live inside a system that allowed so little. As you step away from this story, carry these contradictions with you. Hold the image of the river that is both judge and repository of rumor. Remember Francisca as someone who had no legal counsel, no public altar of justice, and yet made a choice that forced everyone else to look away or to reckon. History will never give us the full account, but listening carefully to what people told one another keeps the past alive, stubborn and aching in the manner it deserves. Thank you for listening. If this moved you, leave that one-word reply, justice or law, and share the story. Subscribe for more hidden histories. We will meet again at the riverbank of another past.